Cliff, can you please tell us your full name?
Clifford Anthony Cardoza.
Okay,
It's not Hispanic, it's Portuguese.
great.
And the Z is there because back in the 13th century, the Jews wanted to differentiate between Christian and Jewish. They put the Z to identify the Jews. They put the S to identify the Christian. That was in the 13th century. That's in the history book.
That's very interesting. So today is the 4th of October of 2014, and we're in the Native Daughters Adobe in San Juan Bautista. My name is Sheila Prater, and we're meeting with you today for the purpose of having you share with us all of this wonderful material that you have about your life and your memories of San Juan Bautista. So I know that you came with some ideas about what you'd like to talk about, and if you'd like to either outline that or start, I'll ask you some questions in the middle of it, but
Proceed with any questions if you wish to know. Preface.
I'm very interested in your family's history in San Benito County and also specifically in San Juan Bautista. And I'm also very interested in your life and your personal connection with San Juan Bautista.
Well, San Juan Bautista has certainly the most significant history of all communities in the statehood of the United States on the western coast. And it's always intrigued me related to the history that has a profoundness in the creation of its government, of its people, be it political or social. San Juan somewhat is the centerfold of all aspects of the Western history. I have always been strongly interested as a kid because I, of course, was born in Hollister in 1938, but my grandparents came here in San Juan in the early 1900s. My mother was born in San Juan Bautista on September 12th, 1917.
Can you tell us the names of those grandparents and your mother's name as
If
well?
I might just step over here to get that family history associated with my grandparents. My grandparents came from Italy, and my grandfather, Fulton Manito, that's Fulton, F-U-L-T-O-N. Fulton Manito was from Genoa, 25 miles north of Genoa, called village of Jesvala. I've got a history to that too. My grandmother was Maria, and she came from that same community in Jesvala, Italy. My grandfather came here in about 1906 with his brother Joe Manito. Their last name was Manito. My grandfather, his mother, was a Bonificino. Bonificino, John Bonificino and all that clan, that's related to my grandfather on my grandfather's side, which it would be my great-great-grandmother. My grandmother, Maria, was a Rabellino from the same community. She also was Genovese. She came to San Juan Bautista in 1916. And at that time, she knew my grandfather and her future brother-in-law, Joe Manito. She came with Carmelina Bonificino Tuso. She, Tuso, was married to a Tuso that lived in Hollister but was here before 1900. She came with my grandmother in 1916. She, Carmelina, was the sister to John Bonificino Sr. that lived here in San Juan. Mm-hmm. And so the basis of these people came from Italy, and it's interesting relative to the preponderance of people that came from the European countries. There was a very large community in San Juan that were from Italy, mm-hmm. primarily the north. So in connection with my grandfather and my grandmother who came to San Juan, they married in December 7th, 1916 at the Sacred Heart Church in Hollister. But their best man and best woman, best man was Joe Manito, my grandfather's brother, and his wife then, because he married early on, it's such that Joe Manito married Jenny Ottoboni. Jenny Ottoboni was born in San Juan in 1880. She, of course, was a descendant of family that came from Italy, and they were the Ottobonis on her side. Married my grandfather's brother, Joe Manito. So the Manitos associated with that relationship was on my great uncle's side, Joe Manito. Then, after the marriage in 1916 of my grandfather Fultine and Maria, they married and had the first daughter, which was Elvira Marie Manito. She was born September 12th, 1917.
And that's your mother.
That's my mother.
Yes.
So I'm just trying to give a thumbnail sketch related to how we started.
Mm-hmm.
So my mother was born, and in December 24th, 1918, my mother was just a young infant. My grandmother, Maria, was pregnant with her second child. My grandfather died December 24th, 1918, here in San Juan as a result of the Spanish flu. Within that 2-week period in San Juan, there was 7 deceased as a result of the flu epidemic that they referred to as the Spanish flu. So my grandmother now had one child, which was my mother, and then the second one that was coming in March 4th of 1918 was my Aunt Eleanor. Eleanor was born March 4th, 1919. And because my grandfather had died December 24th, 1918.
Yes.
So now my Aunt Eleanor was born. They were living on the old San Juan Road in a house that's still existing over near the Ottoboni Ranch on old San Juan Road.
Was this across the street from that? Was this next to what they called the Last Chance Saloon?
The Last Chance Saloon, of course, during my time period was Frenchie's Bar.
Yes.
That was just past where on the corner there was an associated station that was split. This one went to the Canyon, this one went to Hollister. Here's the station on the corner, and then as the road that goes to Hollister, that first little house, it's a wooden structure that sets back on the south side of the highway. That little whole house is still there. That's where my Aunt Eleanor was born. Mm-hmm. Okay, that house was still there and had been occupied by my grandparents prior. So anyway, my aunt was born, and now my grandmother is having to raise these 2 little children, and she had relatives on the Manito side, which are my grandfather's relatives, and the Bonifacinos. So she then proceeded to raise these 2 daughters. Then in about 1921-22, she met Joe Natti, who was from Piemonte, another area from Italy, who had been here in 1904. Anyway, that was Joe Notte, N-O-T-T-E, who was from Italy, but he'd come here early on. Now, in 1922, Joe Notte marries my grandmother, Maria, who was a Manito. Her husband was deceased. She marries Joe Notte. She has these 2 daughters that are, one is my mother and the other is my aunt. Then he essentially is the only grandfather I knew because he was the only living person that was associated with the family, and he married my grandmother, and he raised the two daughters, being my mother and Eleanor. And then they moved at that time, after this marriage, they moved to a home which I have a picture of. And that picture is that home that was owned by the Lavaninos that they rented for $15 a month. It had, it was a place where there was an above ground old cellar. That cellar is the cellar that my grandfather had all his wine barrels and winemaking equipment.
This is in the 1920s?
This is in the 20s.
Yes.
And anyway, he raised his own grapes, crushed his own grape, made his own wine. And that home was there facing the road, adjacent to, which was you referred to as the Last Stop Saloon, which I remember as Frenchie's Bar. And it was Frenchie and his wife Hilda who owned it. They had bought it from friends of my father, which I can't remember their name, but it'll come to me. Anyway, Frenchie's had it, and then he was deceased years later. But as a kid, growing up, because I was raised a lot in San Juan by my grandmother, and the reason why my mother was sick, we lived in Hollister, but my mother was sick a lot. So after I was born, I was raised a lot by my grandmother here in San Juan. And in connection with that location of the old house, which in Italian we called it baracca. Well, baracca in Italian is shack, but it's a house that still is surviving today without the old cellar. And that house, when I was born in 38, probably was built in the late 1880s.
Where is that?
That house is still existing, and it's on the road. Just as you break away at the corner there, this road, the old road goes to Hollister, and the old road goes to the canyon. It's right on the corner across the street from that old station that Mary Sullen Velasco used to have. I think she bought it from Bill Jacinto in 1946 after she came back from the, I think she was working in the shipyards up in Oakland. Anyway, so from that time frame, 1938 when I was born, to January 1944 when my grandmother died, the family still lived there. And the family still lived there was my Aunt Eleanor with my grandfather, Joe Natti. And I refer to him as my grandfather because I knew of no other person as a grandfather who was just a fantastic grandfather to me, very kind and very giving. And anyway, he raised his own vegetables. He raised his, I can remember raising pigeons, chickens, and then of course, everything that was in those days, they raised primarily their own foods. Inside the house, it had one faucet associated at the sink in the kitchen. It had one faucet that was cold water. The wood stove, which is in the kitchen area, was essentially that stove that was fired by wood, and a tank on the side, which was about a 10-gallon tank. It was heated by wood, fire of which heated the whole house. And it was just a pleasure to sit there as a kid in the winter and hear the wind and the rain on the outside. And the window faced the southwest. And at times in the afternoon, you could see the plume of smoke over the rise, which the hill was owned by Nyland. But in that direction, you could see the plume of smoke come off from the stacks of the cement plant, which I have pictures depicting that. So in connection with that location of the house, I grew up and spent many years there. of which was with my grandmother who died in January 1944. And my grandfather, Joe Nati, was still living. My Aunt Eleanor was, at that time, married to Clinton Ott. Clinton Ott was my uncle who had come from Nebraska to this area in 1937. And he met my Aunt Eleanor at the old community hall, which they used to have dances every Saturday night. My father was born, Tony P. Cardoza, was born in Hollister. He was born there on April 4th in 1913.
What does the P stand for?
P is Philip.
Philip.
And anyway, it's actually because his grandfather was Philippe, Manuel Philippe Cardoza. And that's another story in itself, but we're talking about the descendants associated with San Juan Bautista on my mother's side.
Okay.
So in connection with the location of the house, I was raised there a lot in San Juan, and of course I went to school, started school in Sacred Heart School in Hollister in September of 1943. But I was taken care of by my grandparents most of the time because my mother was sick. So my grandmother dies in January 1944. My uncle Clint Ott is in the war, World War II, in the European theater, and he's there until the end of the war, which was August 1945. He comes home about October of 1945, comes back to San Juan. My grandfather, Joe Nati, my Aunt Eleanor, and their daughter, Sheila, which is the only child that they had. That is Sheila Ott, daughter of Eleanor and Clinton Ott. They lived in that house, all of which the amenities which I identify, the old wood stove, the heating of the water, the pouring of the water in the bath, if you had to take a bath, that was a couple times a week because you didn't waste the water because you had to heat it. You had to chop your own wood in order to take and have the kindling and everything else associated with the building of the fire and the wooden stove.
Where would you chop wood?
Well, you had to chop wood because it was that fuel that was used in order to heat the house,
Yes.
heat the stove and everything else. But in connection with, remember I said they had a garden, they had their own, they had pigeons, they had chickens, they had that food that was prepared. So you were somewhat self-sufficient.
Mm-hmm.
As a kid, I learned to be self-sufficient
Yes.
because it was called manual labor. Manual labor, you used your head and your two hands. Yeah, so anyway, I grew up with a strong willingness to survive as a result of the people, my grandparents, my parents, that made a contribution to that willingness to live and work. I have a strong ethnic association with the appreciation of the hard work that my descendants provided for me to exist today. So I have a great fondness for family, of which gave me life, and I had that portion of life that had an association with San Juan Bautista. And as a youth, I always appreciated the history, especially in the mission and the connection with the mission, because the mission was another community, even though it was the religious aspect of families, much of which was tied to all of these families, most of which were connected to the Catholicism of that church, being the mission of San Juan Bautista. So my parents, both Tony and Elvira Cardoza, were baptized at the mission. My parents, Tony and Elvira, were married at the mission October 25th, 1936. They were married at the mission. I was baptized, born in Hollister, March 18th, 1938. I was baptized at the mission in April of 1938. So that association with San Juan and Mission comes through the family lineage of this church, the mission. And then, of course, in that, or as the years progressed, I was married at the mission in May 5th, 1963, to my wife, Claudia. And then we had two daughters, Julie and Deborah, both of which were baptized at the mission. So that history associated with the mission is very solid in the relationship of families on both sides.
So tell me, Cliff, do you have any siblings?
I have one sibling, and that is Nadine, and she was born June 20th, 1940. That's the only sibling, and she's still living. In fact, I think she's June 20th, she just turned 75. She lives out of Sacramento. Mm-hmm. And anyway, it's such that as times progressed, my father, Tony P. Cardoza, bought a business automotive repair shop from Booth Rhodes and Prater behind the San Juan Bakery. He bought that in June of 1955. Dad had a business, automotive and gas station business in Hollister, which he had just before the war, World War II, that he bought in June of 1941. I was 4 years old. And then, of course, the war started December 7th, 1941. Then he stayed in that business until June of 1952. And then he sold that business in Hollister. Then in June of 1955, he bought this business here in San Juan. And
So tell me again where that was.
that was located just behind the old San Juan Bakery that was owned by Reno Carnaggio. Mm-hmm. And just as a tidbit of information in connection with when I lived at times with my grandparents here in San Juan, we would walk from the location of the house, which was across the road from the tax property. Mm-hmm. And the tax property, they had bands of sheep. So in connection with the location of the barraca, or the house, the old house, we would walk there downtown, and my grandmother would then stop at the mission, which was Rocca's Food, the grocery store. Behind Rocca's was a hardware store that was owned by Mike and John Bonfanti. Now, the Bonfantis were Italians, one of which was married to a Rocca that owned the grocery store, of which that grocery store on a fourth generation still exists in San Martin today. Mm-hmm. That's the Roccas.
Now this was in the Plaza Market building?
That is in the Plaza Market building that the Lavanino owned, exactly. But at the back portion was the hardware store. The front was a grocery store. And then we would walk up, let's say, Main Street of the San Juan, and then proceed to the old Bank of America. And in that building complex, you used to have the Morenas meat market. And of course, all of these things associated with the businesses were somewhat individualized, because the meat cutting, as the case with meat, you went to the butcher shop. The butcher shop was the Morenases. If you wanted pastries and bread, which Reno Carnaggio baked the French bread every morning, and that bread was prepared at the bakery that Reno Carnaggio owned. So you'd go to the pastry as well as the bread shop for that. So there was individual type things that existed as the businesses. And most of the people at that point in time walked. They didn't have the transportation that is available today. So from that standpoint, it was a social outing. that was visited by a lot of people during the course of going downtown and shopping, then coming back and preparing whatever meals you had. And that was somewhat the social activity of life that existed from the eyes of, in this case, a small child that I remember in association with my family and the people of San Juan Bautista. Many of the people then that lived in San Juan, they were employed by two large businesses, one being Faring Morris Seed Company, which was located out in San Juan Valley, that started prior to 1900. The other was the Portland Cement Company that became the Mission Cement, Portland Cement. And from that, it also changed name, I think, about 4 times. But that, I believe, was started in a construction of 1912 of the cement plant. And my grandfather, Joe Nati, was one of the first employees of that cement company.
What did he do?
He was one that was a utility person, and that utility of which was manual labor that existed in the aspects of manufacturing the cement that they hauled from the quarry. And they hauled from the quarry before on a small gauge railroad from the quarry down to the plant.
This would be limestone?
This is limestone.
Limestone, yes.
And then in the preparation of that stone that was converted to a powdered cement that was through milling at the cement plant, that cement plant that was built in about 1912, it produced much of the employment for the people that lived in San Juan Bautista. That is another history which I have documented.
Great.
On City of the Cement Company. My grandfather, Joe Nati, was also associated on the railroad that transported the rock quarry from the quarry to the cement plant, and then from the cement plant down to the connector, was a narrow gauge railroad. He was the foreman on the line that repaired the railroad and maintained that for the operation of the cement plant, as well as that made the connection for the location of the train that was from city of San Juan out to Beatable.
Oh, to Beatable.
To Beatable.
Okay.
That's where the main line was.
What about the railroad that went to Chittenden?
Okay, Chittenden is that same railroad line that I also have a history of that and pictures of which you would like to see. That in connection with that Chittenden line, that railroad was started, I think it was Southern Pacific. And that railroad was from Watsonville through Chittenden, but it primarily was also transporting materials that were in the quarry for granite rock.
Yes.
And then it continued to tie into 101, Highway 101 at Beatable, where the San Benito meets the Pajaro River.
Yes.
That juncture was the location of the narrow gauge railroad that came originally from the cement plant, transporting it through to San Juan, from San Juan to Beatable. Then at Beatable, it made its connection to its main line that went north and south, and then from that location through Riverside or Chittenden to Watsonville.
Riverside Drive, yes.
And it also made a connection that was one of the first railroads to be constructed in the state of California in around 1872 to that location that was Santa Cruz, and then Santa Cruz to Watsonville, then Watsonville to 101.
So I always thought that there was, that the railroad from the cement plant actually had a route that was not through Beataville, but that went directly to Chittenden. And it had to cross the Pajaro right there in the Chittenden area. But,
Okay, let me,
Yeah.
I'm trying to work the thought process associated with what I have as the history. Now, I don't say I have everything that validates all aspects of the railroad location and ties, but from what I have to recall, from the quarry to the plant was a narrow gauge. From the plant that had now the transportation of the finished goods was sacks of cement, as well as bulk cement, which I have.
bulk cement.
Bulk, okay, which was then from the plant to San Juan, and the location of that where it just at the corner of the juncture of this road that took you to the old grade, San Juan grade, and this location to Hollister. The railroad used to cross and go through at the back of the tax property. Across the road from where my grandparents had this, what I refer to as the barraca where they lived, was an old water tower adjacent to the railroad line that came from the San Juan. I have a picture of an old steam engine that was on that line that went from San Juan out to, in this case, Beataville. Now, Beataville was somewhat of a center location of the railroading that went north, south, and to the west.
So, what would you describe as the exact location, of the Beataville stop or station or loading area?
Okay, you know where off the west side of the highway, before you go north on Highway 101, on the west side of the highway, there is a frontage road. And associated with that frontage road location, there was a beet dump.
Is that still where that beet dump
That's where the
is?
that's
right.
right.
Now? Yes.
Because before the beet dump location, the activity of commerce that was transported by trains was that which made the transfer of those that were taking the materials of commerce activity from the west to the north to the south. That was the railroad line. It was parallel to 101. It made its location there. And that location in the 20s, late 20s, then, which I refer to a beet dump, because the beets came into existence through the Salinas Valley and then, of course, into the San Juan Valley into the early 20s. Beet was sugar beet.
Right.
And the sugar beet was the agricultural product that was grown a lot in this area. And it was transported by a lot of, in this case, trucks. Aside from that, it started with a railroad. And then, of course, the truck activity. And I can remember as a kid the beets being harvested out in San Juan Valley. And the harvesting of that was all by hand. And then they'd load, you'd see all these beets flying, being loaded one at a time, being tossed into the truck of which would be loaded there out in San Juan Valley and then transported over to the beet dump. The beet dump, then the truck would drop its load of cargo into a holding pit, and that holding pit then would be transported up to that which was a loading transfer to the railroad car at that point where the beet dump is today.
Yes.
And then it would be transported to Salinas, because out at Salinas there was a large processor that was owned by the Spreckles family.
So this would be actually in the town of Spreckles.
That's
correct?
right.
Yes.
That's right. So that's the association of these things, of activities, be it the railroad and all. Getting back to after the war started in December of 1941, so you had a shutdown of the cement plant in 1942, 43, 44, 45. The plant didn't start up until 46. in that interim, my grandfather, Joe Natti, who lived in San Juan, was employed up until that time that it shut down. He then he knew the president and owner of the cement plant, and the owner lived in San Francisco.
What was his name? Do you know?
That's what I'm trying to remember. You put me to task.
Oops.
And my mother always told me the story associated with going up to San Francisco and my grandfather being with the family. And this was in the early day, but anyway, in connection with that, he became the night watchman for this plant that was shut down. I can remember as a kid when my grandmother would prepare his dinner with a lunch pail and a thermos. And on a couple of occasions, he would take me that evening to be the watchman for the night shift, take me to the plant, and he would go through from his office with a kerosene lantern. He would then make his routes, stopping and checking all the checkpoints of the plant that was shut down, that being the cement plant. And I can remember vividly one evening being with him and going into where the grinding of the rock in these big kilns that were drums that evolved when it was operating. This was all shut down. And being in that vast, large building, seeing these very large milling machines that crushed the rock, that pulverized it to a cement grade of powder. And we were up on a platform, and that platform looked out over all of this, and it wasn't completely dark, but aside from that, it was just something that vividly sets in my mind that I can't forget. And that was in the war started in 41, 42, I was 5 years old, 43, 6. So it was about 1944, to give you some perspective of that chronological activity of years. And he then was the night foreman at the cement plant, occasionally taking me, and I remember that vividly. Then the plant, which was shut down, and it started in June, it was about early part of 1946 when the plant started operating again. My Uncle Clint was back from the war in October of 1945. He was in the European theater. That my Uncle Clint ought. And then my grandfather worked at the cement plant. Then in his capacity then, because he was older, he was a janitor, taking care of all of the offices at the cement plant. And then he retired from there. But in 1946, they had the startup again of the cement plant. And then they had, in 1946, if you want to call it a rebirth of the old San Juan Fiesta Rodeo, which that started in the early part of around 1908. Originally, that's a history, and the whole purpose was for the restoration of the mission that had been somewhat devastated as a result of the earthquake in 1906. So this whole activity evolved two things: the mission and the people of employment that were at the cement plant. That was the primary employer, and all of these things evolved. So the activity of the cement plant supported the San Juan Fiesta Rodeo that started back up in 1946. And from 46, I guess they had an activity of the parade and horse show activity in July of every year until about 1978, somewhere in there. And that whole activity, which was contributed by a lot of volunteers associated with the parade and the festivities of the horse show, which was an RCA show, And the following weekend you had the RCA show, which was the Salinas Rodeo. So that was all a professional event. Many of the families in San Juan and throughout the whole area always contributed a lot to the chicken barbecue that they had at the mission in the Olive Grove, and they always fed about 5,000 people. I have pictures of it that go back to 1946. So the significance of its aspect of social activities, it was always the people. The pride of these people to make a contribution was not really a political thing. It was a pride of enjoyment of doing something for their community. It's like the pride of ownership. And all aspects of what I believe in today are somewhat of a springboard from the people that raised me. And all of that aspect of appreciation to what San Juan was, and to some degree is still, is the heart and soul of a community that we'll call something that is diminished. But unless you have walked in their shoes, you don't know their strife or pleasant surprises of things that they contributed. Okay, I think I know what you're identifying as Indian Corners. Does not Sonny Reyna live in that location?
Yes.
That old, which was Frenchie's Bar.
Yes.
Well, it's a misnomer. Things change because of people identifying it to whatever they wish. I always say, if you wrote the book and are author of the book, that is your prerogative to identify whatever. If I wrote my book and the authorship of whatever I present, that's my documentation. We might be different, but if you want to write my book and you write your own, go out and write your own book. That's history. It's to whatever one wants to perceive. I know that history. I know it well, but I like the history books to the documentation of the people that were there and lived it. The way I read it today from the authorship of people that have documentation. Just for you, the bar was owned by an Italian family, which you identify as Indian place. That was Frenchie's Bar was bought from, God bless, been trying to think of that name. Anyway, they lived up, they were good friends of my father. My father was a kid that grew up, he was born in Hollister, but he grew up in San Juan Valley. My grandfather had bought a ranch out in San Juan Valley. And he was friends to this guy that his family owned that bar. It was only, it'll come to me, I'm sorry.
That's all right.
But anyway, there's also Hilda and Frenchie, after they died, that bar was bought by Mel Silvera in Hollister. His mother and father bought that. They were from, if I'm not mistaken, they were from over in the valley, somewhere in the Gustine and Los Banos area.
They were Azorians.
They were Portuguese.
Yes.
But aside from that, they bought it from Frenchie from Hilda, and they bought it, and because Frenchie died, he was a big man, I remember that. He was good friends to my folks and my aunt and uncle. Porta, P-O-R-T-A. Angelo Porta. Angelo Porta, he was a good friend of my father's, and his family owned the bar. It was an Italian family, right next to my grandparents, which I identify the house as the baracca. That's who owned the bar, who sold it to Hilda. Angelo Porta was a son of a mother and father, actually stepmother. His mother died when he was a young kid. And Angelo Porta was a young friend for a long time of my father's. And Angelo Porta played the accordion. My father played the accordion. This is early day. They were good friends for a long time, and I can always remember stories about my father and my mother telling stories about Angelo Porta. But the Portas really were the ones that had that bar, but prior to that, it was a location of a stagecoach stop. To where? To the location of Salinas over the old San Juan grade, huh? Because my grandfather used to talk before the construction of the highway off of 101, which is through the lateral.
Yes.
The highway to Salinas was over the San Juan grade. And my grandfather, Joe Natti, would say, the Mama T, she no go over the hill.
The Mama T.
Mama T. The Mama T was the Model T
Yes.
that didn't go over the hill up.
Yes.
It had to be backed up
Oh my gosh.
because of the configuration of the mechanics to the fuel pump. It wasn't electric and it didn't pump the fuel. So what you had through a gravity flow, you had to back up to the summit and then turn it around and drive down.
That's pretty amazing.
That's the Mama T, she don't go up the hill. That's what I remember. But anyway, the stories of which were several things like that that I learned from my family and friends and whatnot. But it was Angelo Porta that was the family that had that bar.
So was it actually, there's a house that's next to what was called Frenchie's Bar and the Last Chance Saloon and was a stage stop. And I believe that someone named Andres lived there for a while, more recently, but it's actually just north of that as you're heading toward the San Juan grade. Right now.
Past where my grandparents lived?
Is that where they lived? Did they live next
No.
to the?
No, my grandparents lived in the house that's there, which is the last house before you go up to San Juan grade. And up on the hill, back of my grandparents' house, then there's a house back here behind Frenchie's Bar or the Indian Place, whatever. That's Frenchie's Bar. Adjacent to that Frenchie's Bar was Ben Ahern, that stately home.
Yes.
It was Ben Ahern. He was married to Ernestine, who was a Lavanino. And then 2 doors down, adjacent to that, was Ernest Lavanino, who was the postmaster to San Juan Post Office, right? The Aherns, Ben Ahern, was the superintendent of the cement plant. So he was married to Ernestine, and he lived next door to his brother-in-law, Ernest Lavanino. And then a couple of doors down after the war, then Ernest Lavanino's son lived there, and he was associated in some management capacity of Ferry Morris when he got back from service. Then I believe he relocated to Fresno. Anyway, that's that.
Okay.
Now, up on the hill, back of my grandparents' place, up on the hill, which was the Nylands property, up on the hill there used to be an old house. That house, and of course all of that hillside used to be grazed with sheep.
Yes.
From the tax, Louis tax. I think it was Louis tax. Antone tax.
Yes.
That was the father of Louis.
Yes.
Antone tax, as such, had on the corner that large piece where the eucalyptus groves and all of that they had. That was the center of farmhouse location. They raised bands of sheep. A lot of times they'd be herding the sheep down from the San Juan grade into the front of my grandparents' house. Up on the hill was an old house that was, there was a lot of overgrowth of brush and all, but it was a nice home, old home, that was built way before 1900. When I was a kid, staying with my grandparents, pardon me, I would go up the hill, and there is a slip of earth that happened as a result of water that collected and the land slipped up on that hillside. It's still there to this day. To the south of that was this home up on the hill. It's no longer there. That house was occupied by Maggie. Maggie was a descendant of bear with me.
Maggie Twitchell?
Twitchell. You know, Twitchell. Maggie Twitchell had a boyfriend who was the person that associated with tax as a relative that herded the sheep. Anyway, he lived up there. Maggie, I wasn't sure if it was her children. There was 3. I guess it was her nephew and 2 nieces. One was Joseph, and the 2 nieces were in my class, Twitchells. Now, if you check the history books associated with the early expedition of the Anzer expedition, I believe that you'd find the name Twitchell.
Maybe not.
Somewhere along the line. Go ahead.
I think the Twitchells actually were LDS. They were Mormons.
I've heard of that.
Yes.
But from the standpoint of what I had told to me, now I'm not saying I wasn't there, but from the standpoint of Twitchells, they were related to the Castros. Ray Castro's wife in Hollister, who had the Hollister Soda Works, was a Castro, descendant of the early day Castros.
Yes.
So
This was Maggie's mother.
okay,
Yes.
okay. Pardon me.
Had the Hispanic.
Okay, it's Old Spanish.
Yes.
Because I say Old Spanish because many of them, aside from the occupation of Old Mexico, 3 flags being Mexico, Spain, and America, that association of these families came through the existence of what? Old Mexico, Old California, and they had these names associated with whatever flag they were under of a government. Castros I remember well. Twitchells went to school with me, that being Joseph and the 2 sisters. And my mother, when she lived there at the old house, up on the hill, this is when she was a little girl. And remember, she was born in 17. She was there at that house in 20. 21 is when her stepfather, Joe Nati. And of course, she's always said, this is my real father, which is no one else. So in connection with the people up on the hill when she was young were the Medinas. Julian Medina, who was a sheriff, his family, because she would go up and visiting, and she would always remark about how the wonderful tortillas and things of which were prepared by the family, Mrs. Medina and her family. And there's Mike Medina, Julian Medina, who was the sheriff and whatnot. So in connection with that early day, and then after they left there was the Twitchells, Maggie. But my mother would always tell the story. So I'm just inheriting, reflecting on the stories of which were told to me in connection with my family, my grandparents, my uncles, my aunt, because my uncle, Manuel Cardoza, he owned up on the Salinas grade before you start up, he owned a ranch, and he had that location in 1935. That was Manuel Cardoza, Manuel F. Cardoza, that was my father's brother. My uncle Manuel Cardoza was born in 1904 over in Selma. But my grandfather brought him over here to Hollister. Then as years progressed, he bought the ranch. He had a son, Danny, the only child. Well, anyway, they had the ranch up there on the hill, apricots, and across the ranch from where they had was the DeVries, DeVriss, DeVries. That was rented, leased to my cousin Danny Cardoza. He had that as a cattle ranch, along with a trucking business that he had. The interesting thing to the location of my Uncle Manuel Cardoza's ranch is the house that he relocated from the Anderson pear orchard estate, which Jack Z. Anderson was a congressman in the 40s. I think he was there until 1950, relative to being a congressman, maybe 52. But aside from that, my uncle bought that house that used to be occupied up till 1935. It used to be occupied by Jack Z. Anderson on the Anderson estate. My uncle bought the house, had it relocated, where present day it's there, and Jim Dassel Jr., he owns it. He called me about a year ago, and he said, you have to give me some history because I find this name, and you were referred to maybe knowing the layout of things. So I went there on a Saturday morning. And he said, can you identify these people? I said, yeah, on the cement steps. It was a year date. My uncle Manuel Cardoza, and my aunt, not Rosaline, Marion Cardoza, and Danny Cardoza. This was the family. Identified in the concrete on the steps. So then, of course, I gave him some history relative to what I remember in the 40s and early 50s. Because I was with my cousin Danny Cardoza. He was 5 years older than me, but I was like a brother to him. In fact, I was his best man when he got married many years ago. And of course, unfortunately, he died as a result of a drowning accident, clamming in January of 1962. Never located his body.
Oh, that's very sad.
And he had a son he had a son that was a year and a half, and Margaret, his wife, was pregnant with a second child. She was about 6 months, and then he drowned, and she, of course, gave birth 3 months later to Debbie, who was the second child. And that was my cousin Danny Cardoza. But in connection with that location, that ranch would had apricots, and then in the back, up on the hill, they had livestock. And that was my uncle and aunt and Danny Cardoza. But the house was relocated in 1935 from the Anderson estate that Jack Z. Anderson lived in, and then my uncle bought it and relocated in 1935. The interesting thing too, the Andersons that came out of Santa Clara County were very prominent and wealthy people associated with what their holdings were. They had the pear orchard, you know, the packing house there so it used to be Pride of San Juan.
Yes.
That packing house was the Anderson packing shed. Across the road to the west was all of the pear orchard. All of that pear orchard was planted by my grandfather, Manuel F. Cardoza, and my two uncles, Manuel Jr. and Frank.
Wow.
Early day. Now, how my father came into existence, Tony P. Cardoza, in connection with meeting Joe Nati. Years back, Joe Nati used to prune the pear orchard of the Andersons. My father used to be with his father overseeing the ranch and whatnot, and he met Joe Nati, who was his stepfather to my mother.
Yes.
And my mother, of course, was 5 years younger than my father, going to school in San Juan. Early day, my father is acquainted, and through the years, then that relationship is founded, and in 1936, they married. That's how that association came about. It's twists and turns related to what's happened, but there's significant history of the ties, how things come about.
Yes.
Here's a picture of my grandfather, Joe Nati, and that's me when I was about 2 years old. That's me, and this is at the ranch of Joe Manito. Oh boy, it's going. And that's in about 1940. I was born in 38, so it's about 1939.
So where was this?
That is at the ranch of Joe Manito. Out, you know where Bill Cagney lived on that lane? That's where the ranch was.
I see.
You know the Nishidas?
Yes.
Frank Nishida and Dennis Nishida, I think it's where Dennis Nishida lived, because they bought the ranch from my great uncle, Joe Manito, in about 1949.
You have the most incredible memory of
No.
dates.
Oh, numbers are my, well, whatever.
So do you have actually a negative of this as well? Is that what you have in here?
I have some. There's a negative. That's a negative.
Yeah.
And these pictures were given to me by my Aunt Eleanor. By the way, my Aunt Eleanor, who was a Manito, she was also my godmother. And I always treasured her as a person. And Alfred Manito, who was the son of Joe Manito, who is the oldest child of Joe Manito, my grandfather's brother, nephew. Alfred Manito was my godfather. So that's the ties associated with the relationship of Manitos on my mother's side. Okay. My grandfather, I told you about the story of raising his own produce associated with the garden all. This is my grandfather. This is in about 1944, because Sheila was born in 42, Sheila Ott. That's Sheila standing with my grandfather, Joe Nati. That's in 1944. If you'll see the garden. And in the background is what we refer to as the baraka, which is the place that was the house that was owned by Lavanino, that was rented for $15 a month, early day. A lot of history to that.
I have a question for you about the place where Maggie Twitchell lived.
Okay.
Is that the structure? Now I'm having a brain fade. Was that torn down maybe 6 years ago?
Yes.
Okay. So that is a structure that did the Solarsenos live there too?
Larson's?
Solarseno?
Boy, I don't know.
That might have been
I know. That sometime after, because it was there. Yeah, it was. And they had to go through the gate up on, it was Cattle Guard Gate
Yes.
that went up the hill. Yeah,
Yeah.
because that was up on the hill, and that, of course that hill is still there, associated with a little, let's say, outcropping. Okay. Beautiful vista up there from the overall valley.
Yes.
Beautiful location, because I used to go up there as a kid. But yeah, that was about some few years back that it was removed.
Yeah.
But that was an old building when I was a kid.
Yes.
Even the house and the baraka that was owned by Lavanito that my grandparents rented, that was an old place. My Aunt Eleanor and Uncle Clint, my grandfather, left that house in 1952 and bought the house that was built by Joe Columber Sr. That is the house that they still had, and my Sheila and her husband still own, over down, I don't know, 3rd Street?
Third Street is the main, what you call Main Street. is
Yeah, you know where the grocery store is? What is it?
The Plaza Market?
Not the plaza.
Windmill?
Windmill. You know where that's at?
Yes.
Over from that, and then there's some apartments. in back of that? Back of the
Oh,
windmill?
yes. Okay, so this is what Joe Columber, it's a little subdivision that Joe Columber
That is
built.
correct.
Yes.
That's where my aunt,
Okay.
but my aunt and uncle bought that house in 1952 from Joe Columber Sr. On that. And that house is still within the family, being Sheila Betancourt. That's my cousin. That house is still existing. Here, this is when I was about, a year old. I'm in the stroller, but this house and the window that is looking out from the kitchen, where the stove is on the inside, in the kitchen area, the wood stove. And you would be at the stove in the wintertime, peeling an orange, putting the orange peelings on the stove that was heated by a wood. And it was very comforting that you would be putting the peelings and the fragrance of that orange permeating throughout the house. And my grandfather or grandmother telling us kids stories about whatever it was in the early day.
That's wonderful.
And looking out this window to the south, to the southeast, you would see over the hill rise the smoke plumes from the cement plant.
Yes.
That was all a vista that I saw out of that window.
That's great.
My grandfather, Joe Natti, used to have a lot of relatives and friends come down from San Francisco. Well, before many of the Italian families that lived in San Juan before 1929, which was the crash, had truck farms and worked at the cement plant. 1929, when you had the crash and the closure, I know the owner of that was Parker. Parker was the owner of the Mission Cement Company, lived in San Francisco. Because after the crash in 29, my mother always told the story of driving up with my grandfather, Joe Natti, my grandmother, and my aunt and my mother going to San Francisco and asking Mr. Parker if there was any work available. And my grandfather got a custodian job and in connection with the work to the plant because he had been on the railroad line maintaining it from the quarry to the cement plant. And he got this job and worked through the Depression years. And my mother said that he gave my grandfather $10 and he said, take your family out to a dinner. And my mother said, you can't believe what we ate on for $5 in San Francisco. That was in 1930. It was just amazing. So it's stories like that that are very vivid. But in connection with family members and friends and all that moved from here up to San Francisco, a lot of Italians, and it's such that there's a picture right here of my grandfather and Basaglia. Basaglia is an Italian name, which was a friend who lived in San Francisco to my grandfather. This is the old baracca. This is the above ground cellar, and these are the chickens that he raised.
Is the cellar gone?
The cellar's gone, but this house is still there.
Yes.
Right there is the old bathroom.
So I see that this is it's like a Xerox.
This is a Xerox. This is I couldn't find, I don't know where, it's somewhere in archives. Okay. Then
About what year would you say that photograph is?
that's got to be in the 30s,
Okay.
about 39, 37, somewhere in there. Late 30s. Yeah, late 30s. Then, of course, the history to this is I get things. This is my mother in 1918, Elvira Cardoza. Elvira Manito, she was born September 12th, 1917. This picture was taken in 1918. By the way, she was born in a house that was occupied by my grandparents on Main Street, over from the plaza where the Lavanino the building is. You know where Hardines?
Yes.
and there's an art gallery. It used to be a pool hall. Before that, there used to be a residence.
Galleria Tenotson,
Yeah,
it's called.
that's where my mother was born.
In that building. Did they rent it?
Yeah, they rented it. Here.
Did the Portas own the property across the street? The Autobonis did,
Across the street from where?
like next to Doña Esther's.
Portas?
Did they ever own that? No?
Not that I can recall. That was
Where the phone company building
the
was?
telephone was built. No, that was and it was a two-story. You walked in from the sidewalk. Here's the phone company. Here's the phone company. I'm talking on the corner where, and then of course a two-story building, stucco white building. Okay, and then walked in. There was a little plaza and the stairs. That was an old Italian friend. In fact, didn't Bakich family live there at one time?
I don't know.
Well, I can remember going there with my grandmother. This is before 1944. And because they were friends and they would talk Italian. And we would go into this little courtyard and then the stairs of which went upstairs to the house, the location. And downstairs was the bar. And that was before January 1944, way before. That I remember as a kid. And they talked to see, I coincidentally talked Italian up until I was 7 years old. This is pictures of which one is the identifying of the Rovero Bunda and Bundo that had a truck farm garden out near what is Vineyard Road?
Mission
Vineyard Road. They were Italians from the same location of my grandparents in Italy. This is in 1932. Bunda and Bundo, husband and wife, Rovero.
What is this? Do you know what that plant is there?
It looks like a cabbage or cauliflower.
It's huge.
Yeah.
Though. Look how big that
I
is.
know.
It's like
Yes.
it's as big as
Right.
a person.
Right. But anyway, that's their truck garden. Many of these people that came out started with truck gardens, little plots. Then they'd raise the vegetables, of which they'd sell to the neighbors and whatnot. That's how my grandfather, Fulton Manito, and Joe Manito, his brother, started on a plot of land over where Autoboni's is located.
So Autoboni's, when you say that, I think about riding back of the gas station that Mary Sellen used to.
That is
have.
correct.
Yes.
That
About
is correct.
16 acres or something, but maybe they had more.
They had more.
Yeah.
They had more.
And this picture.
Okay, this
below
picture
it-
is a ranch house associated with the outcropping of the barns and whatnot. And in the background, there's a vineyard. This is over in that area where Nyland had a racetrack.
Okay, where there's the mushroom farm now.
Right. That's the background to it.
So are any of these buildings still there today?
I don't think so.
Yeah.
I don't think so. Because this is in the late 20s, early 30s. It was adjacent to their place.
Okay, so but did someone live there, or this is just a picture of
This is
the
just a
property?
picture that I had.
No, that's
Yeah, that they
that's
gave
very
me.
interesting.
Yeah. Then another picture that I have is related to the house that still exists that my grandparents lived over near Frenchie's Bar.
Yes.
This picture was taken in the 70s.
Okay.
That is a house that my grandparents lived. This was a bedroom up front. And this was that kitchen window that I talked about.
Yes.
Okay. It was a wood stove. There's a stove stack. This is my grandfather, Joe Natti.
What year was that taken?
This was taken, let's see, this was at a picnic of the cement plant. Let's see, I came back to Hollister in 1966. This probably was around 1972, my grandfather.
He lived quite a long time.
My
didn't
grandfather, Joe Natti, died when he was 85 years old. He was born in 1880. Yeah, he was born in 1880 in Italy. Interesting thing to his life, as a kid, the stories, few of which he told me, is that he and his brother left Italy when he was 14 and went to Buenos Aires, Argentina.
Wow.
And his brother was 3 years older. He was 14, his brother was 17. They left from Genoa to Buenos Aires, Argentina. For 3 years, they had a taxi business. And he worked with his brother, horse and buggy relative to a taxi in the city of Buenos Aires. Then they came back to Italy. Then that's when he was 17.
Mm-hmm.
And there was a lady that lived in his town in Italy, this is Jonati, that she was Mrs. Schutte. She lived in Hollister, came to this location before he did.
Ida, was that?
Ida was the daughter.
Okay.
Ida was Tubbs, married
Yes.
to Tubbs.
Yes.
Ida was the teacher, Tubbs, and she was the daughter of, I forget, we referred to him, Mrs. Schutte. Mrs. Schutte had a two-story home on 6th Street in Hollister.
Yes.
Used to be a bed, like a
Yes.
house where people occupied a room. And anyway, she had, Mrs. Schutte, written to my grandfather in Italy telling him to come to America. This is before 1906.
Wow.
I think it was 1904. She wrote him a letter coming to America. She was from the same town in Italy. That's what brought him to America.
It's totally amazing.
And in connection with him being a friend of Mrs. Schutte, her husband dies,
Yes.
and then she has 2 children, one of which became a pharmacist, and Ida became a teacher. But as a result of raising these children, she had a housing boarding house in Salinas.
Oh, I didn't know that.
And she got this boarding house as a result of my grandfather loaning her $700 in the early days. And she always told the story. She wrote a book, and in that it has a couple of paragraphs associated with Joe Natti loaning her this money to go into business and having a boarding house. And then 3 years later, she acknowledged the gift of donation relative to loaning. And she had my mother, my aunt, my grandmother, and Joe Natti come to a dinner which she gave and gave the $700 back to him.
That's amazing.
That's a friendship, huh?
That is.
And she always told me, I can remember as a young adult, one day she saw me back of Black Cooper Furniture in Hollister going down the alley, and she came out, Cliffy. Yeah. Elvira, my mother. Cliffy, you look just like your mother, Elvira. I says, yeah. She says, your grandfather. So she proceeded to tell me the story. In the end, she gave me a book, copy of which tells the story about my grandfather in Navarro.
This is amazing. Did she actually publish this book?
She published
What's
it.
it called?
Oh,
But you
early
have-
days, I have a copy at home.
Okay.
I have a copy at home. But anyway, it's just the nature of having stories like this, of which the friendship and relationships, they help one another.
It's really about
Okay.
community.
Oh, yeah, totally. This is very vivid in my memory bank associated with family being friends and all of that relationship, of which there's my grandfather, Manuel Cardoza, my father's father, bought a ranch. You see, my father was born in 13. My grandfather bought the ranch in 12 out in San Juan Valley on Olympia Avenue. He bought the ranch from Benjamin Flint Jr. and with small acreage. But the story goes that my grandfather came and was a Well, he was a baler. He had a hay baling operation with a horse team and all that. That's another story that you just can't believe how they existed and they came about. But anyway, he was loaned money to buy the ranch by a Portuguese called Manuel Sultan. Manuel Sultan.
So
That's the Portuguese pronunciation. You know where Mitchell Road is?
yes.
They used to own the ranch, that two-story Victorian. That's Botero.
Really?
Botero, but they bought it from Joe Gallard's family in 1951. Before that was Manuel Sultan. And up the road from that and down on Olympia was my grandfather's ranch that he bought in 1912. My father was born in 1913. So there's all that kind of relationship.
So, so back here, this picture of your grandfather, Joe Naughty,
Uh-huh.
I numbered this number 10 right here.
Yes, that was
Yes.
a picture taken at a barbecue that was put on at the Bellotto Park. I think it was about, let's see, I came back in 66. This was about 1969, 70. So many years ago. My grandfather lived till 85. But he was my mother's stepfather, but there was no other, and he was a wonderful man associated with. He is buried with my grandmother up on the hill in the cemetery plot up here.
Right here?
Yeah, in San Juan. I got a lot of relatives up there on the hill. In connection with the mission that I identified as that center, this picture was taken in fact, I got a large picture of it in here. The large picture is the mission picture that was taken in about 1930, just after the Depression of 29. This is the parish. And over here in this picture is my grandfather, Joe Naughty, and right there, and my grandfather, Manuel Cardoza. Over here is my dad, my Uncle Frank, and my Uncle Manuel. And somewhere in here is my mother and aunt. This is a picture taken about 2930. Father Caffrey is here in the center. The mission background is the old style belfry.
Yes, I noticed that.
Here?
So you have a larger copy of this photograph? It's
Somewhere in
your,
here.
Your newspaper.
I got the original too. I collect these, and then I know the stories of them, some of which I've identified and put in books. The mission, of course, was that center, social, religious, whatever you want. Here's that picture in a larger scale in connection with the barraca.
Yeah, so this one, oh, I see, you say
It's just a-
78.
Yeah. I took it in 78, the picture.
And this would be Frenchie's.
That's correct.
Yes. So I marked that number 12.
Yeah. See, now this is all in connection with a story of pictures collection that identifies the family on my mother's side. This is her marriage that was in 1936 at the mission. This is my father, my mother.
She was taller.
Yeah, taller than my dad. This is my Aunt Eleanor.
Oh, that's amazing.
This is Clarence Andrade. This is Alfred Manito. This is his wife, Yvonne. This is my Uncle Frank Cardoza. This is my Aunt Eleanor.
Okay.
I mean, Rosaline.
So from the left, it's Frank Cardoza.
Frank Cardoza.
Yes.
Rosaline Cardoza.
Yes.
Small ring bearer. This was Joey Manito.
Okay.
This is Alfred Manito, his brother,
Oh.
my godfather.
Okay.
This is Yvonne, which is his wife.
Right.
My father, Tony Cardoza, my mother, Elvira. And this is Jacinto.
A Jacinto child?
Yes, this is, not Emily. Yeah, she was married to Zazueta.
Okay.
That's the ring bearer, or flower girl, my Aunt Eleanor and Clarence Andrade. This was taken by Cook's Photography, and this picture was of the wedding party on September 12th, 1930. No, I take that back. It was October. My mother was born September 12th. This is October 25th, 1936. This was the wedding party.
So who actually was Cook's Photography at that time? Do you know?
Who was Cook's? It was Cook. And they started in the 1900s.
Was his name Orville?
I've seen that name. Yeah, I've seen that name in print. The Cook started in Hollister. They've taken my parents' pictures, and if I'm not mistaken, that picture that was taken here of my mother, that was taken by Cook's. I think this is a picture taken by Cook's. I don't know who that is. I've been trying to identify it. But this is a Cook's Photography. My baby picture was taken by Cook's. Cook's, right today, they still exist. I think it's fourth generation.
In Salinas?
In Salinas, on Old Main Street.
Yeah.
Okay? They're still there. Because I was at Green's here some months back. I was Green's Photography across the street from Cook's. And they were there still.
Was Kenny Cook used to be Cook's
Right.
Photography?
He was the son of the family
Okay.
that started, in fact, his grandparents, Old
Started-
Cook,
Yes.
Orville,
Yes.
started in Hollister.
Yes.
Okay?
Yes.
And then from that, they came and they had business in San Juan. And then, of course, there was many families associated with the picture taking, and all was all by Cook. And then they went to Salinas. And that's where they're still at.
They lived, Kenny Cook lived across
Right.
the street from me when I was growing up
Okay,
in Salinas.
okay, so you know the history to that family.
Just a little.
Right. Anyway, so what I have here is just stories of which are associated with my mother's side. This is a celebration of my mother's 90th birthday,
Boy.
and that was celebrated at the San Juan VFW Hall. I have a lot of the early day history that was prepared by a member or relative that was associated with the Bonificino family.
And who, is that a person who is a Bonificino, like John Bonificino?
This is John Bonificino.
John Bonificino.
Senior.
Yeah.
Because remember, Johnny is their junior, who's called Nani.
So
This
this is
is-
number 14.
This is Joe Manito.
Yeah.
This is my grandfather, Fultine. And this picture was on a mantle in a house in the village of Jasvala in Italy, early day. A relative of which was in this house and saw this picture and said, "Can I make a copy of it?"
Wow.
Of which they brought it to America.
Oh, boy.
That's the picture. That this picture is before they came in 1904. This picture was taken in Italy. That coincidence of a story associated with how, what, and where. Joe and Fultine Manito came to Genoa in Italy to disembark from Genoa to Argentina. The boat would be 3 weeks late getting to and arrive in Genoa. They had had a letter, correspondence, from a relative associated with, through other family members, called Tuso, who lived and worked in San Juan for the Ferrymore Seed Company. This is early 1900. They then decided that they would not wait for the boat or ship for 3 weeks, decided to take the boat to America
Instead of Argentina?
instead of
Oh, my
Argentina.
goodness.
Guess what?
You're lucky, Cliff.
Where they ended up. Flip of the coin.
Yep.
That's how and what and where.
Yes.
Stories like that are just a moment of fate.